should be able to see my screen okay right now. Let me just, there we go. Very good. Well, hello everybody. Like I said, I am Aaron Pearlman. I'm the Principal User Experience Designer for Deque. And I think Zoom tends to put a bit of UI in the way, so I apologize if I look like I'm kind of frantically moving my mouse. Hopefully it's not showing up. And so today we're going to talk about the types of optimizations that you can make for keyboard-only and assistive technology users. As I sort of mentioned a moment ago, these type of optimizations, these type of things aren't going to preclude anyone else from using or they're not going to be unutilized by other people as well. They just tend to be things that are going to be more advantageous to users that dominantly use your system with keyboard only or assistive technology. For those who are unfamiliar with what that means, what a keyboard only user or assistive technology user is. A keyboard only user would be somebody who just typically uses your keyboard to traverse the system. So they're going to be using tab and shift tab a lot and the arrow keys to traverse your system. So focus is quite important to them. You might find this when an individual may have motor skill issues, may have vision deficiencies as well, the keyboard only users. And then assistive technology users also use a keyboard to traverse your system. They may use other assistive technologies as well, such as screen readers like VoiceOver or a Braille reader or something like that. So that's kind of what we're focusing on, our users of that nature, because a good portion of individuals who have disabilities tend to fall into this camp. That doesn't mean everybody. Certainly, there are a myriad of different disabilities and gradations in between. But for the purpose of this is kind of where we're gonna focus on today. So a little bit of an overview of what we're going to cover. We're going to talk a little bit of design process. Was planning on maybe doing a little bit of an exercise type of thing that we might go into, maybe not, with regard to skip links. And then skip links are going to be one of the kind of features that we're going to cover. Modal ways to optimize your modal, and how to handle focus. So these are going to be the three big categories that we're going to cover, and then we'll have time for questions when we're all done. So to start, I thought we could do a little bit of UX design process overview. I always, in different workshops and stuff, I find that there are kind of a myriad of different individuals that are there from lots of different disciplines. Not everybody is a user experience designer, so they may not be as familiar with the process that many UX designers employ. So for this, I thought we would just briefly go over it. We're not going to spend a tremendous amount of time on it. But I always find it merits going over just briefly, also because it's going to tie into designing accessibly as well. So most UX design tends to go through a process called kind of discovery. It's not always called discovery. Sometimes it's called, rapid ideation, rapid iteration. A lot of people have different names for it, but the point is it's the part of the design process where a lot of the fabrication happens. It's a lot of the time where we have all the different ideas and requirements gathering. It's when we're doing a lot of research and we're synthesizing that with the organizational goals, and we're kind of filtering that with all of that information. And what comes out of it are typically artifacts that allow us to be able to build the system that we're going to be making, or the features that we're making. Those tend to be, they're not always, but they tend to be things like prototypes. Sometimes you'll see mental models that will come out of them as well. But a prototype in some level of fidelity that is a reflection of how your target user is going to achieve their goals. The TLDR is that we iterate design and we test with users, and we iterate, test with users, and iterate, test with users, and then in the end we end up it ends up going to be built. The reason that's important is the considerations for sort of accessibility are that we want to be thinking about and doing accessibility throughout that design process. And different levels of fidelity can merit thinking about different types of things. It really depends. Won't go into all of the sort of a lot of that, but just in general, that we want to kind of incorporate those heuristics and methods, and we're going to, as designers, grow our prowess of accessibility over time, just as we would grow our prowess of being a good user experience designer over time. So there's not an expectation in the beginning that you're going to go and read WCAG 2.1 and you're going to read the ARIA spec and then you're going to be done and you're not going to make any more mistakes, or you're not going to miss anything when it comes to your designs and designing accessibly. That's not necessarily reasonable by any stretch of the imagination. So just know that you're going to be learning over time. Certainly, I still make mistakes in accessibility and everything that I work on, and it's just all about getting better. So yeah, and that's my secret, Captain, is I'm always designing accessibly. So one small plug, though it's relevant to what we're going to be working on today, is Cauldron. It's our fully accessible pattern library at Deque. We use it to build our own products. It's an HTML, CSS, and JavaScript front-end framework. It's very similar to Bootstrap if you've ever used anything like that. We also have a React library that's a sister library too as well, if your team develops in React. But we're going to be looking at a few of the things in here today as examples. But this is open source. It's available. There will be a link to it at the end of this deck, which I will make available to everybody. We'll make available to everybody. And it's free for you to use and get on Git and branch it and use it to your heart's content or contribute to it. We'd love to see a contribution to it as well. So just a small plug, but we will be referring to it as we go through. So for the first thing that we're going to look at are skip links. And for those who may not be familiar with what a skip link is, skip links are little links that will tend to show up in as the very first tab stop in a web application or a website. And what they allow you to do is they allow you to bypass parts of the website. Why would you want to do that? Well, if you have a website that has really rich menu that may be a big billboard menu or just has a lot of stops to it, if you're a keyboard only or assistive technology user, when you get to that site and your voiceover begins to read off of it, or even not, even maybe you are just you are a sighted user, you just use your keyboard only, you're going to have to tab cycle through all of those different items to get down to the content or to the workspace that you want to begin whatever your activity that you're doing there is. And so what a skip link allows you to do is to bypass typically navigation to get to the sort of workspace area of that application. And there can be multiple links sometimes, and typically you only see one, but we have some examples. I'll show you an example of where you can use multiple skip links as well. So I thought we could look at a couple different types of skip links, or a few different types of skip links, and then we'll kind of look at another page that doesn't have a skip link, and maybe talk a little bit about where one might be useful there. So the first one we're going to look at, hopefully you can see my screen okay. The first one we're going to look at is the skip link that we use on deque.com. And what it is what I would call sort of a displacement element, in that it displaces the page. So when I tab into here, I can see the skip link is there, and it will tell me to skip to content. And when I select that, it will send me to the content below. And I call it displacement because it literally inserts, it unhides itself and inserts itself into there and displaces it. This was the skip link that we chose to use for our content, but it's one that's very common. You'll see it sort of insert itself at the top of a website or web application. So the next one we're going to look at is one at a site that I'm sure that many of you have used or use quite frequently. It's Amazon. We'll look at their skip link. When I tab in there, if you look in the upper left corner there, you'll see it overlaid. This is an overlay style. This is very, very common, where it'll overlay the content. And so it will obfuscate whatever's behind it to show you the skip to main content there. The pros and cons between displacing versus overlaying are negligible. If you find that your content is something that you never want to obfuscate, then you may want to insert something and just use a displacement one. Vice versa, if it doesn't matter, that's fine as well. If your content is, if you're designing content that reads from right to left, like Arabic content, you may put your skip link in the upper right corner. It may merit that. It really comes down to what's appropriate. But ultimately, that discretion will be to the designer and their team. So this is an example of two skip links that were a single skip link, and I thought I would show you one where there are multiple options inside the skip link. So I'm gonna pull up that example. This is from our pattern library. Now, for this particular example, I wouldn't actually design something that had multiple skip links for it because it doesn't really merit it, but we just did it for the purpose of demonstrating it. So I'm gonna tab in, and in the upper left corner, we use an overlay that shows you two skip links right here. And these are tab stops inside of here. So if I hit tab again, we're going to tab into the next one. And if I tab away, it's going to go. If I tab again, it's going to leave, and it's going to go into the header at the top there. I'm going to shift tab back, so that we can see that we kind of can move in and out of here. And then I will go ahead and enter one of these just so that you can see it. And what happens at this point when I select it, it sends me into the workspace area, and it actually focuses that workspace area. And what you'll see for a lot of web applications is they don't actually show the focus itself. We wanted to show that, and in our applications, we do show that. And we don't, this isn't a focusable element, so to speak, but it is something that can take focus. And then from here, we're going to focus, and then we can go to the different items inside of there that are the focusable elements that are inside of there, the interactive elements. So those are examples of a few different ways that you can do skip links. Like I said, there's an example inside the pattern library. You're welcome to use it. We also have a version of it as well, I believe here, that has, there. So we have a single skip link example as well, and you can just use that as well. So we have a couple different examples here. But those are examples of common ways that you can use skip links, and they are primarily beneficial to individuals that that only use their keyboard to traverse the system or use assistive technology as a result of that. But that sometimes that there can be other instances where that a skip link potentially could be beneficial. I've seen it can be potentially beneficial. You could imagine an instance where the big workspace of your site is maybe it's a bunch of search results, and it does a kind of a lazy scroll where you'll scroll to the bottom and it'll load more results, and scroll to the bottom and it'll load more results. You scroll to the bottom and it'll load more results. Well, how do you get to the footer? And I've had this trouble actually before, where I've gone to search engines and I was never able to get to the footer. And what would have been nice is a skip link that actually let me skip to the footer, because I was looking for information down in the footer. So there's ways that skip links can be beneficial to that. It's not the only way that you can solve that problem. Certainly you can use, hotkeys or shortcut menus as well. There are lots of different techniques to accomplish these goals, but that's kind of the one that skip links tend to be very, very good at doing. So some things to keep in mind when designing a skip link is that typically it's going to be the very first tab stop on your website, web application, and that's the commonly where it's found. And so if I'm a screen reader or keyboard only user, I can get to it immediately. It's the very first thing I can do when I enter in. So if it's something that a web app that I use frequently, I can get right to what I'm trying to do. It should also sort of be visually depicted where it is supposed to be in the information, in the AI, basically. So you can put skip links in other parts of your application as well. Like I could put one here if I wanted to, if I had a long scrolling stack site and I wanted to do that, and I wanted to have a skip link within something. I think I'm fairly sure that you can anchor to different things like that, but it should visually be represented where it should be inside of the application. In general, that's extremely uncommon. Most skip links are always in the upper, are always in the very first tab stop. So in general, don't do that. I think you technically can, but I would say don't. And then the final thing is it is a it's an interactive element, so it needs to pass color contrast. So make sure that it does. If you decide to use like an image or something in it, I don't know why you would, but if you did, it needs to have the proper accessible name along with it as well. In general, most people use text and links, so it's going to be marked up as a link. So just make sure that it is passing color contrast so that folks can see it. Very good. So that's kind of all we have for skip links. It's a fairly succinct, but a very, very common pattern that you see everywhere. And it's something that you can add fairly, it's a fairly straightforward to add to your web application, but it can make a big difference for individuals who use their keyboard or assistive technology. So let me go ahead and close this. And let's move on to modal optimizations. Chose to do this because modals are very, 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 very common amongst most web apps. And they come in a lot of different forms, a lot of different ways that modals are sort of shaped and created, but some common things that I see that show up in modals are things that, one, we can correct, and two, there are some optimizations that we can do to make it a better experience for our keyboard only and assistive technology users, and in general will I think make your modal a much better one. So one thing I thought I would show here really quickly is one important thing that a modal needs to do is it needs to be able to trap focus inside of it. So I wanted to show an example of this right here. I love Dribble, by the way, so this is not a dig against them. This is probably just a small kind of oversight here. I use them all of the time. It is a delightful site and has wonderful stuff on it. So if I were to hit the sign in, the sign up, here's a modal here, and something that can happen sometimes, if you notice carefully, I'm hitting tab, 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 tab. As you can see behind the scrim, it's a little bit difficult to see. You can see focus hasn't quite been trapped inside the modal, and this can happen sometimes. So if I was a user who's using assistive technology or a keyboard only, it would be very difficult for me to get back to this. It's something that happens very, 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 very commonly. And it certainly can happen when you're inserting different sort of interesting things into modal. So something we want to make sure of, and the reason I'm bringing that up, and the reason that's actually very, very important, is when a modal is evoked, it needs to sort of announce itself to let the individual that evoked it know what they basically just opened, that they actually opened the correct thing. And so and the way that it can announce itself is that either the body of the modal needs to be focused, or potentially the header of the modal can be focused, so that we can tell the individual that's evoking the modal that it is what's happening. So if they have voice, they're using, for example, voiceover on it, it'll tell them what they're looking at. So I thought I'd give a couple examples of ways that the body can be focused, and then an example of how a modal can focus the header instead, and then what we can do with that. So I'm going to open up this really quick here. Very good. And so the modal that they have for this, I think it's a clothing site right here. And what happened is it focused the body, and I can show that best by, I'm going to turn on voiceover really quick. I'm going to pull it up
Voiceover on Chrome, Bonobos,
And I know
fitting,
you won't be able to hear it,
Google Chrome, Aaron.Pearlman at DQ.com.
but you'll be able to see it.
Close the cart. Your cart is empty. Group has keyboard focus.
So
you are currently on a group. Open your cart. Close the cart. Your cart is empty. Group.
So
right currently on a group inside of web content. Voiceover off.
So right there, when I focused it, it read out kind of a bit of everything that was going on there. Your cart closed and your cart is empty because the body of it was focused at that point. And that's perfectly valid. That's a perfectly valid way of focusing your modals. It's not a problem at all. And then from there, you can tab cycle through everything that's inside of it. Another common way of when a modal is evoked is to focus the header, and that's what we do in the modals that we use for our applications. Is we focus the header. So I'm going to evoke the modal, and as you can see right here, focus is right here where it says modal with form. There's focus is right there on the header. We actually, rather than indicating that as like an index, we programmatically focus that. And the reason that we programmatically focus that is as I tab cycle through here, it's now going to the close button, also in the header, then to the first interactive element, which is field, to the next field, to the next field, to the next field, tabbing again to the save, tabbing again to the cancel. And from here, when I hit tab, if that header was a tab stop, it would go there, but we chose not to do that. Instead, we go to the close. And the reason that we do that is just if somebody was using VoiceOver, as you may have seen some of what was being written and was going into my ears at the same time. It was actually a bit distracting because it speaks very quickly. It's a bit chattery. And so one of the optimizations that we wanted to make for the experience here was to make it a little less chattery. So yes, we announce it, we programmatically focus modal with form when they first get there, so that it lets them know that the modal that they evoked is in fact, it's what they're currently focused on. But we don't need to announce it again and again and again if they were to cycle through this, shift cycling through this modal. So it's a small optimization. It likely would be completely invisible to the majority of your sighted mouse only users, but that small optimization, you can imagine if I used modals a lot for filling out forms frequently, and I was a user that used keyboard only or assistive technology, that optimization would add up over time. So it's a little thing little teeny user experience things that we can do that can make a significant difference kind of overall in the sort of care that we can put into our designs, so that they are they're the most optimal experience that we can provide. So speaking of handling focus, the last one that we are going to go into is focus handling itself. And we saw one example of it, what can happen if focus can get lost in certain types of handling. But rather than it being just something that can be a significant issue, the way that you handle focus can change significantly the experience that an individual would have. And really the rule about handling focus, especially with the two instances that we're going to look at right now, which are removing and adding elements to like your workspace or whatever you're working in, is that it can definitely change how somebody interacts with it. And so we want to make it follow the expected experience that you would have for somebody who is a mouse only user, or a sighted user, a mouse only user, I should say. So in this instance, we're going to look at, oh, it's not going to let me drag it over. Hold on one second. I'm going to have to take this out of here temporarily. There we go. So you should be able to see an example of a modal that I've designed. It's actually a single modal. We have two kind of images of it, and just one is just showing what's below the fold there, rather than making one really, really long modal. I just split it up so you could see what was below the fold. And on the right side, if you look, there is a trash can icon that is currently being focused. And so when we click on that trash can icon, assuming that there isn't a dialog that says, are you sure you want to delete it? Let's just assume that that's not the case. The real question then goes, well, what happens with focus there? Because when that trash can icon is hit or is selected, it is going to remove instructions 3 right here, but it's also going to remove itself. So where does focus go? So we as designers, we want to choose where focus goes, because otherwise the browser is going to choose where focus goes if you're making a web application inside of making a web application. And we don't want the browser to choose where focus goes, because it tends to throw things to the body. So in this case, where we really want focus to go is we want focus to go to the next focusable element, not necessarily the sort of what I would call sort of the analog to that, which would be focusing the next trash can, the trash can for instructions 2. Instead, we focus instructions 2 itself. And the reason we would want to do that is, you can imagine if somebody accidentally hit using their keyboard only, they hit return, and then they hit return again, it would have just deleted 2 sets of instructions instead of 1. And we prevent that for a mouse only user by literally having those things physically far apart, but we want to also be able to prevent that because focus is what they're using to traverse this. So I thought I'd show another example of what do we do when we're deleting the last item in an entire section here. So now we've got cooking instructions, the final instruction for instruction 1, where does focus go here? Now for this particular one, it's going to follow suit with what the previous one was, which is it's going to go actually up to the next focusable field again, which is ingredient. 1, for the same reason that we wouldn't want to throw it to the trash can again, because then if somebody again hit select again or hit return again, they'd accidentally delete 2 things that they didn't want to. But wouldn't also, for the same reason, we wouldn't necessarily want to throw that to the to one of these links here, because we would have the opposite problem, where they'd be accidentally adding things as well. And we don't necessarily want it to go to the body, because if we go to the body and your voiceover user, your assistive technology user is just going to start chattering about the modal again, or rather than letting you continue to interact and do what you intended to do. And then finally, the final example that I have here is, what do we do when we're going to remove sort of the last item in in this case, in the modal here? There's nothing left. Where would I send it? And this is definitely up to the discretion of the designer as to where it should go. It's not going to be inaccessible if you choose to send it to the close, or send focus to maybe to the cancel. This doesn't necessarily make it inaccessible. It's just that it really comes down to what would you expect? What information would you want to convey? What narrative do you want to convey to that user? And where we choose to send it is we choose to send it back to the header, to let the user know that they're still on the modal, they're still there. We haven't closed it on them, for example, there. And so that's actually a programmatic shift, because like I said, it's not tabbable. It's not a tabbable focusable element like that. So we programmatically shift focus to that in this particular example. So those are kind of some nice examples of what to do maybe with focus when you're removing items. So I thought I'd show an example of what you do when you're adding an item. So I've got an example of that real quick here for focus retention. And right here, we're going to hit this add another, you can just focus here, hit add another ingredient, and focus then shifts to the actual ingredient, in this case, the field that you added, for 2 reasons. 1, because the assumption is by adding that next field that we wanted to interact with it. And that would be the expected behavior. If I was a mouse only user, I'd be adding that ingredient, presumably so that I could actually begin to type text into it. And then again, we wouldn't necessarily want to keep focus on this add another ingredient for the same reason that if they hit return again, we wouldn't want to add 2 ingredients instead of 1. Sort of the opposite problem of the previous example. And the final example I kind of wanted to show, because I think it might be worthwhile showing, is I may not actually have that example. I may pull that up in a little bit, but that I can describe it pretty aptly in that if you have what do you do when you evoke a modal, for example, you save something, the modal goes away, where does focus now go? And what we tend to do, the kind of rule of thumb around that is that you want to send it back to whatever element evoked it. So if you imagine if you had a little edit pencil and you select it, it opens up the modal, you fill out that modal, you hit save, you'd want to send focus back to that interactive element there. That tends to be what we do. There may be instances where you want to send it somewhere else. If it's a wizard and it goes somewhere else after that, it's again to the discretion of the designer to what the narrative that you're trying to tell as to where to go. But for things that are sort of like the instance that I just described, which is very common, you evoke a modal, you do something with it, and you it gets dismissed as a result of that, and the context doesn't necessarily change. You're going to want to send that focus back to where it was. And the reason for doing that is so that a keyboard only or assistive technology user can kind of pick back up with where they are. Because remember, they're kind of in that space, and that space is somewhat linear as to how they traverse especially when they're using tab to get through everything. So I think we are just about at 40 minutes, so just about at time for all the sort of examples and things that I had. So I'm going to pass it back over to Scott.
Thanks, Aaron. That was pretty awesome. And we do have a lot of questions from the attendee, as well as a few from Vitaly, who couldn't make it today because he's traveling. So Pawan, who's a regular attendee of our webinars, asks, when you're removing an item, shouldn't we have an acknowledgement of the action and move the focus there and then move to the next element?
When removing an item, should you have an, are you referring to like a notice, like a toast, or are you saying should you have a live region that is letting you know kind of what's happening? If you're shifting focus to remove an item like the ones that I just showed in that particular instance, the evocation of that delete, for example, should be adequate enough to let them know that they in fact deleted it, should be gone. Also, if they're using voiceover, it's going to pick that up as well. If you're interacting with something and it's making changes somewhere else, for example, like you did something and then it changed some metrics somewhere, for example, you're probably going to want to use a live region that does something politely to let them know that that's happened. That's kind of something that's sort of out of the purview of where you're working in specifically. I hope that answers your question. It might be diving into something that's a little bit more technical. I may have to have I may need to follow up a little bit more with some of it if we're going to get into deep technical kind of implementation stuff.
For sure.
I want to refer to my developer so I don't steer you awry. But in general, that tends to be the case. The example that I showed should be adequate. Now, if you wanted to, because it's a delete, you could have like an interim part where you throw an alert and say, "Are you sure you want to delete this?" In which case, you're just reinforcing it further what's happening.
Right. So yeah, let's try and keep the questions user experience focused. So from a user experience standpoint, how would you manage focus for notification messages?
Focus for like a notification?
Yeah.
I can show you one if you'd like to see.
Sure.
Yeah, we can pick back one of them because we happen to have toasts, which are notifications. So I'm going to open up toasts here. So in this case, yeah, so this is actually being focused right now. This toast is evoked and it is being focused right now. And you can actually, as you can see, you can tab into the close right here. So it depends. So if I finished something and I wanted to notify them that it's been finished and I toast it, then I'd wanna focus it so that they can see that it's been, that I'm communicating that information to them. Yeah. So you want to shift focus to it.
Melanie is asking, do you have any tips or resources for navigating slideshows?
For navigating slideshows.
Very specific.
Yes. So navigating slideshows. Okay. We don't use them very often, so I'm going to answer this as best as I can. So one, slideshows, or especially ones that are like carousels, they need to have a control so that you can stop them. I think that's an accessibility need, is that they have to have some kind of control and a mechanism so that they can be stopped. Anything that's an animation-wise, can't animate for more than 5 seconds at a time, and then the animation has to stop. That may not be relevant to what you're doing, but it is moving. It is moving, and you know, those controls then need to be focusable. Most carousels have a lot of fancy new ones will have menus that can come up when they get hovered over or focused on. Just consider that all those controls need to be traversable, and then they're very, very image heavy. A lot of carousels and slideshows need to be, so that you're going to need to have proper alternative text on them. Just the kind of things that you would sort of expect. Off the top of my head, I don't know of any like fully accessible carousel that I can think of, but let me see if I can find a better example, and I will try and pass it along through Smashing and have that available if I can find it. It's a great question because they come up a lot. I end up tending to solve that problem in a slightly different way because I think they're tricky, but that doesn't mean that they can't be done.
Fair enough. Rebecca is asking, can you give a use case for skip links? And then similarly related, Patricia is asking, do you know how to solve the issue with skip links in Safari plus VoiceOver? And again, this may be more technical than user experience related. So
yes, the second one, I'm not entirely sure what actually is going on, that there may be an issue there. Again, I can try and see if that's something that our developers have encountered before and how they've gotten around it. So we'll make a note of that and I'll try and circle back. But for the first one, what's a use case for skip links? I want to avoid giant banner menus and I want to get straight to a sale that I heard that there is today. And I don't want to have to do that. If I was a sighted mouse only user, I would just visually ignore it and then go move my mouse over and just click on the sale item. If I'm a keyboard only or assistive technology user, I would have to tab through all of that menu, potentially a bunch of banner items as well, before I could finally get to the workspace that has maybe the sale item in it. So that would be a great use for a skip link. Get right to the content. Skip to main content is a phrase you see very, very common. Skip to main content.
Okay, that's a good point. And I think in terms of all the user-related questions from the attendees, that covers them. We do have some general questions that we like to ask. So low-hanging fruit for people that are trying to build an accessible website. If somebody wants to put together a site in a few hours and make sure it's accessible, what are some of the easy things that just they can check off the list right away?
Sure. So some things that you can do immediately with any site or application that you're working on are you can review your font choices for things like color contrast. They should be, there are plenty of color, if you put in color contrast selector or picker or something like that, you'll get it, and you'll just put in the hex value or the RGBA value of what your font is, and then with the background, whatever it's sitting on, whatever element, the background color it's sitting on, and make sure that it's meeting at 4.5 to 1. So that's one that you can do immediately. Check your color palette, make sure that you want to do color contrast. Where I see that color contrast fails a lot is when people use the endless shades of gray to have various levels of first class, second class, third class elements and things like that. Just make sure that if it's an interactive element that it's passing color contrast. Another thing, check your the images that are important, that are non-decorative images. Make sure that they have alt text. That's a simple one that you can add immediately. And then review your heading structure. Make sure that your H1 tags, H2 tags, H2 tags, H4 tags, and so on, they all make sense with the structure of it, and make sure that the content is properly paired with those heading tags. That's things that you can do immediately. And then also you can this is a small plug, but you can download Axe. That's our accessibility engine. It's totally free. It's a little extension for Chrome and Firefox, and just hit the run button and see what you find. It's a lot of things then that you can help alleviate immediately or change immediately. You can also turn on VoiceOver, for example, if you're on a Mac, and start to go through your site and see what it sounds like for somebody who uses assistive technology. It's a great thing that you can do immediately.
Okay. Nanad has a question here. So what is it about accessibility that interests you, and how did, you've been doing design and UX for so long, but you've only been doing accessibility for a smaller period of time. So how did that catch your attention?
It had been something that had been kind of on the purview of some of the design that I had done in a later part of my design career till I got here. And I've kind of always wanted, in my design career, I've always kind of wanted to work on things that I felt in some way tried to make the world a slightly better place. And I felt that working in accessibility was one way to make, very much believe in the core value of kind of universal design, or more importantly, sort of adaptive design that adapts itself to different types of individuals, to provide kind of what we call DQ, like digital equality. We want everyone to be able to use everything as best as we can possibly provide, that sort of universal experience that we can have. And that just, I don't know, as a person, that very much appeals to me. And so it was just kind of a good fit to learn design. It's also really cool. Designing accessibly is a one-way street. Like, once you start to design accessibly, you never don't not design accessibly anymore. It's like UX designers don't design unless you're, being tongue in cheek. You're not going to design something to have like a really poor user experience. It's going to be part of your vernacular from that point forward. And once you begin to design accessibly, it never goes away. Like, I can't not think about accessibility as I do design, and that's a really, really cool thing. It also affords you to start to think about things you didn't think you had access to. Like, did you know that your focus on your page, like, you can design focus to look differently for different elements on the page? That blew my mind when I found that out, and I thought that was so cool. That it gave me a little bit more control. Like, I knew you could create really cool hover states, but I didn't know focus was a state that you had full control over as well.
Yeah. So our industry, there's always a new trend. That's just kind of how it goes with the web. So are there any design trends right now that you know of that are inhibiting accessibility? And if so, is there any recommendations you can make to kind of avoid that?
I don't know if there's anything that's super trendier right now. When I look at different sites and web applications that couldn't be designed accessibly, I think there are pitfalls that we've been falling into longer than any one trend has existed, or at least has existed for some time. I just mentioned one, which is what I call the endless shades of gray. That's one. In general, just being mindful of of the contrast for your text. It is rampant. It is by far, by an order of magnitude, the most accessibility issues. If you were to like run an engine against it like Axe, it'll be color contrast almost always. So just being really, really, really mindful of that, regardless of where your text is on the page. Another one is just being, again, I mentioned it again, just being careful with your images. If you have an image that's conveying important information to a sighted user, then that information needs to be conveyed to the user that is assistive technology user as well. And what I mean by information that's conveyed is if what's being conveyed is that the person is doing something that's important, you wouldn't necessarily describe it as a man standing. It could be that they're playing baseball. Maybe that's the important part. So make sure that the alternative text matches with the intended information that's trying to be conveyed. I see that a lot too. Even when alt text is there, it just doesn't accurately describe what is trying to be portrayed. And then the other one too is progressive disclosure menus. Many times you see like on hover menus and stuff like that. They don't do a great job of being evoked on focus as well. And they don't always do a good job of so that is a trend I do see. I do see a lot of menus coming up on hover. When you hover over something, you get the secondary menu that was disclosed, that was hidden before, that now finds itself to the front. Also making that be evoked on hover, or a mechanism that allows you to evoke it and that will properly capture focus inside there so that you can use it. So I see that. Those are a few things off the top of my head that I can say I would see a lot.
So as a designer, UX designer, you obviously work with development teams. And a lot of the times when we're doing wireframes and design at the onset of the project, they're inherently not inaccessible. So that it's not really, doesn't really become an issue, it seems, until it comes to the development stage and people start taking that design and turning it into code. So how do you work with developers to make sure that, you know, the design that's being made from the start is going to be accessible when they're done with it? Do you do audits throughout the process, at the end of the process? Like, what's the workflow like with developers?
Sure. So the workflow for our development team is going to be, I think, somewhat similar to a lot of other organizations. We work in Scrum, so we work in sprints and Scrum, and you know, I will go through a discovery process. They're going to be privy to that. They're not going to see it when the design is fully finished. They're going to see it throughout its design phase. So I'll have opportunities to talk with them a little bit about, you know, what the intent of the design is. They will probably sat in on some of the user research that I've done, some of the usability testing that I've done. So hopefully at that point, nothing's really new to them, that I'm not going to get any 11th hour gotchas that we can't even do this thing. Because I still have to deal with all the other things outside of accessibility that every other designer has to deal with. Like, is this feasible? Is it valuable? Is it all of those things that we have to deal with? With regards specifically to accessibility, sometimes I will annotate the designs in a particular way that will indicate where tab focus should go. At the end of the slide deck that I have there, there's a great resource that one of the designers from Adobe put together. I think there's a couple different, I know there's like a PDF there, maybe also there's like a sketch file as well in there. And there may be an XD file as well. I don't think, maybe just sketch. But it shows you like all of these different ways that you can annotate things like accessible names, tab order, and basically they're little objects that you can place on your design to indicate some of those things as you go through. It's a really, really wonderful resource. So I'll include it in here as well. That's a great way of saying, here's part of my prototype, or here's the expected tab order for it, so that you have that as part of your artifact. as part of the sort of documentation or annotation that goes along with it. So that's one thing that we do is I annotate my designs pretty heavily, everything from the size of how certain things are supposed to be to the hex codes or RGBA values for what's supposed to look like and feel like, but then also there are accessibility annotations that you can add to it too. And then just communicating, looking through, the builds as they go through, making sure things like if you made any custom focuses, that those custom focuses look right. Check the color contrast, make sure that it's coming through. The font choices that you've had, there are some fonts that when their weight is higher and they're bigger, their color contrast, it doesn't have to be 4.5. It can actually be a little bit lower, but you're just going to want to just kind of keep an eye on those things, just as you would keep an eye on the experience stuff as well. You're going to want to keep an eye on the stuff that you've been mindful for and annotated in your designs.
So we have a couple minutes left here, so I'll ask one more question. So some people feel like accessibility can stifle creativity throughout the design process. Is that something that you've come across? Like, how do you think creativity fits into accessible design?
Sure. Yeah, that was one of my initial reactions to having to design accessibly, was that somebody basically kind of put the handcuffs on me and says, there's a much smaller box you have to be able to work in. It's true that designing accessibly means that there can be some more challenges because there's more rules that you have to follow. But in the end, I found that the experience ends up being better. And once I sort of kind of removed that misnomer and began to do more and more accessible design or designs that were WCAG 2AA accessible, I noticed that I could pretty much do everything that I wanted to do. I would just need to sometimes express or solve problems in a slightly different way than I did before. So I think a lot of people, when they think about designing accessibly, for example, I'll give a very specific example. When they think about designing accessibly, they think, oh, well, yeah, I can't do all of these fancy visualizations, for example. I'm not going to be able to do all of those things because they're not going to be accessible, because if an individual can't see them, I'm not going to be able to do that. I was designing a visualization that was just sort of basic, just sort of line graph, and so it was like a line graph. There was on the x-axis there was I think it was time, and on the y-axis it was like usage or something like that. And there was this nice little gradient that went down from it, and there was sort of these light lines that went behind it to delineate the sort of months and time. And when I talked with one of my subject matter experts about making it accessible, it turned out I was sure he was just gonna be like, nope. But he said that there was actually just a few things that I needed to do to make this really nice looking graph accessible. One, that line at the top needed to pass color contrast, because that's actually what's conveying the information of the trend over time. The gradiated stuff underneath, it's just decoration. And as long as it's not interrupting the passing of color contrast of that and the Y and axis lines, it ended up being okay. Those lines behind it were okay, but I ended up adding tick marks at the bottom there to indicate that. And then when I hovered and focused over, because when, sometimes you can hover over and it'll add like a dot to the part of to that line, to the line graph, the line part of the line graph. Just making sure that the dot itself would pass color contrast. I did that by doing the sort of donut thing where you put like a white dot with like with another dot on the, or I should say, has like a large stroke on the outside of it as well. And then I added a little bit of treatment in there that would sort of bring those lines that were faded back forward. And it all passed color contrast and ended up being fine. It was a really pretty visualization that passed. Now, granted, I'm not getting into all of the accessible name stuff and being able to do that. There's that, any libraries around that. Put that aside, but at least with color contrast, which is where I think a lot of designers struggle with, you can do it. It's just about being really mindful about those type of things, and getting more examples and just trying different things and having other people that you can pitch those ideas with and bounce them back and forth and check them against is really do that. So I don't think it really inhibits anything. It just makes you have to think a little bit more clearer about how you're going to do it, and making sure that you're looking through the lens of how would an individual engage with this if they had low vision, or if they couldn't see it at all, or couldn't hear, if you're, you know, building like a media application.
Okay. One more question, but I think we've touched upon it. What stage in your process do you start thinking about accessibility? I'm going to assume throughout the whole process.
Yeah, it is throughout the whole process. I'll be a little bit, I'll be a little bit more, rather than, I know that I say that and it sounds a little flippant. So early on, when you're doing things like low fidelity prototyping, you're going to be thinking about things like some tab order stuff. You're going to be thinking about maybe headings and structure, things like that. Those are the type of accessibility stuff that you can think about. Later on, as it gets higher in fidelity, you're going to be thinking about things more like colors and your palettes that you've chosen, maybe accessible names, alternative text for anything that may merit that. You may be thinking about if you're doing any custom focuses, for example, that's probably where you're going to start to think about that. It doesn't mean that you couldn't think about it when you're doing low fidelity. It just means in general, when I go through my process, it tends to be, those things tend to fall into sort of that, into those categories. So, but yeah, you're thinking about accessibility the whole time, but you're not always thinking about everything with it. You know, as you're in lower fidelity stuff, you're ideating, you don't have to, and you're just thinking about ideas and you're just working through ideas. You know, let that creative stuff go through. As you become more attuned to accessibility, it will just sort of intrinsically make its way in, and it will be less of a conscious thing.
Fair enough. Well, on that note, we've run out of time, Aaron. So thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, it was great. I had a wonderful time.
You're going to be at the next couple Smashing conferences, I think?
I will be at the one in New York. Yep.
Okay. And are you guys doing a workshop there?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you again for your time. And just to let the people, the members that are still watching, we have 2 webinars next week. The first one is The Power of Digital People with Christina Podnar. And then we have number 3 in our series with Andrew Clark. So inspired Designs Decisions, number 3. Inspired by Ernest Journal. So, Jarrell. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending today. And again, this recording will be available in the Smashing membership panel once we're done editing it. And we hope to see you all next week. So thanks again, Aaron.